They buried a queen like a secret. They buried her beneath an olive tree. No crown, no anthem, no mourning veil. Isabel II of Spain, once the youngest queen in Europe, now reduced to a name whispered only by wind. The priest mumbled Latin half-heartedly, more out of duty than grief. No dignitaries came, no nobles paid respects. The royal court of Spain remained silent, as if the queen had never existed at all. Only one woman stood by the grave. Her daughter, Leonor di Trastámara, 22, clothed not in royal black, but in the muted grey-blue of winter skies, like morning that refused to beg for attention. She didn't weep. She didn't kneel, she simply stared at the wooden casket, hollow-eyed, hands clenched around a rusted brooch once worn by her mother. "They stripped her of a crown," she murmured, "so I'll give her something better, a memory they can't erase." The grave was shallow, the ground cold and unyielding, like the country that once crowned Isabel and then exiled her. The priest finished. Dirt hit wood with a dull thud. Isabel was gone again, this time into soil that didn't want her. That night the storm hit Turin like a curse. Thunder cracked open the villa where Isabel had died, and Leonor, sleepless, lit candle after candle. Her bare feet creaked across stone floors. The air stank of wax and unanswered prayers. At the end of the hall, a chest, old, iron-bound, forbidden. She opened it. Inside, letters, diaries, court orders, smeared ink, names, dozens of them. The men who orchestrated her mother's fall, generals, cardinals, ministers. And at the bottom, a single envelope sealed in wax nearly broken by time. She unfolded the parchment, one line. "She carries my blood. If they find her, they will silence her, so raise her to remember." The candle flickered. Her hands trembled. For the first time in her life, Leonor understood why her mother had taught her to never ask about Spain. Why she was baptized without a surname. Why her cradle sat behind a curtain. She was never meant to rule. She was meant to survive, until now. At dawn, she returned to the grave, cut her palm with the tip of the brooch, let blood drip onto the coffin. Her voice was steady, but her shadow shook against the wind. "I am Leonor, daughter of Isabel, of exile, of vengeance, and I will not die outside of history." Just as she turned to leave, a carriage appeared on the mist-covered path. Black horses, Spanish insignia. A court envoy stepped out, formal and dry. "Lady Leonor di Trastámara." "But it depends on who's asking. Prince Felipe of Bourbon requests your presence and your hand in marriage. A union between Spain and Savoy, for peace, for politics." Leonor looked back at her mother's grave, her fingers still stained red. "A marriage," she whispered, then with ice. "They didn't come to bury her, but now they want her daughter in their bed." She smiled once, the kind of smile history forgets to record. "Fine, I'll return, but not to be crowned." To finish what she couldn't. The envoy nodded. As the carriage door closed behind her, the wind shifted. The olive tree creaked. And in the soil, Isabel's grave lay still, except for the blood mark refusing to fade. She wore white not for purity, but for silence. They called it a royal wedding, but no one clapped when she walked in. Leonor di Trastámara entered the palace of Madrid draped in ivory satin and diamonds that once belonged to queens she never knew. The crowd, ministers, clergy, nobles, watched her not with celebration but with a curiosity bordering on suspicion. To them, she was a symbol of diplomacy, a convenient solution, a pretty shell with no name worth remembering. She smiled, not because she was happy, but because her silence made them nervous. "You'll be introduced simply as the bride," said a lady-in-waiting. "Not as princess?" Leonor asked. "That hasn't been approved yet." She nodded. Another insult. Add it to the list. The ceremony moved like a machine. No warmth, no vow worth remembering. When Prince Felipe kissed her hand, he did not meet her eyes. She didn't mind. She wasn't here for him. The days that followed were a theater of forced courtesies. Her name was absent from court records. Her voice was not requested at meetings. Her chambers were smaller than expected, and her seat at dinners was always placed 2 chairs too far from the center. And yet she observed everything. when dignitaries bowed to the Queen Dowager but not to her, when the Archbishop refused to bless her by name, when the servants whispered behind doors not yet shut. But it was the marble hall of memory that broke her most, the Hall of Queens. Painted portraits lined the walls, regal, golden-framed, timeless, all of them except her mother. The spot where Isabella II should have hung was empty. No plaque, no mention, only the faint outline of a painting once removed, as if Spain had surgically cut her out of its own bloodline. Leonor stood there for an hour, alone in silence. Her reflection on the polished floor looked ghost-like, unclaimed, a whisper of something once royal, now irrelevant. That night she returned alone. She carried a small charcoal stick, and with calm, deliberate strokes, she wrote her mother's name on the bare wall. If no one will hang her picture, I'll make sure they trip over her ghost. Later that week, at a state dinner, Felipe turned to her for the first time since the wedding. "You've been quiet. Is that not what you married?" "I married diplomacy." "Then you should have spoken to the Pope." He smiled faintly. There was a crack in him, just enough. Leonor raised her glass to no one and drank. And she was called Her Grace, but never Your Highness. She dined in silver, not gold. She was given the crown's fringe, never its weight, but she endured because she remembered every name, every date, every silence. And with every insult, every exclusion, every polite condescension, they carved the statue she would later shatter. "You may keep the throne," she whispered to herself one night. "I'm building the tomb it will rest in." Some people are killed with swords, others with silence. It started with the invitations. Leonor received none. There was a coronation, not hers, but that of Felipe's nephew. The court gathered in silk and velvet, heralds sang, cannons fired into the sky. She watched from a window, not a throne. She hadn't been invited. They didn't even print her name in the program. When she asked the chamberlain why, he only bowed and said, "There must have been a mistake in the registry, Senora." That word, Senora, not princess, not highness, a title for wives, not rulers. Weeks passed. Her name vanished from the court attendance logs. Her portraits never commissioned, her voice never summoned. And yet every morning she still dressed like a queen. She placed her mother's brooch on her chest. She walked the marble halls not like a ghost, but like a shadow, learning where light no longer fell. One morning she wandered into the archives of the royal house, a wing of the palace open only by permission. She asked the librarian for documents from Queen Isabel II's reign. The man blinked, as if hearing a forbidden name. "Those files no longer exist," he said. "What do you mean?" "They were sealed by decree, removed for clarity." She left without a word, but that night she returned. She broke into the archives with gloves and a stolen key. The dust was thick, the air still, and in the back corner shelves had been cleared, emptied, burned. A single plaque remained, nailed crookedly to the wall. "This section is no longer relevant to the present order." She stared at the empty space. A strange calm washed over her, not sadness, not rage, but a kind of confirmation. They weren't just ignoring her mother, they were burying her again, this time with law and ink. The final blow came weeks later, at the royal mausoleum, where every Spanish monarch had their name etched in stone. A new tour guide stood before the latest restoration. Leonor walked past, veiled, unannounced. The guide pointed to the space where Isabel II had once been listed. And here, he said, was a disputed monarch. The plaque was removed for historical consistency. Leonor didn't stop walking, but as she passed, she dropped a small folded paper onto the cold marble floor. On it, her mother's name written in her own blood, folded around a shard of glass. That night she did not scream. She did not cry. She stood in front of her mirror for hours, watched her own face blur in candlelight, and whispered, "If they've erased us from their memory, then we will write on their skin." She was no longer erased. She was imprisoned in plain sight. The palace did not exile Leonor. It did not chain her. It simply forgot to unlock her door. After the mausoleum incident, whispers spread. She's not stable, said some. She's obsessed with the past, said others. Keep her quiet, the court decided, and so they did. They moved her to a wing of the palace no longer in use, the winter wing where the walls leaked when it rained and the windows faced only stone courtyards. A place where wind echoed like footsteps and footsteps were mistaken for ghosts. They called it a retreat. It was a cage, her room was cold, furniture old, no fire lit without approval. 2 handmaidens were assigned to her, rotating weekly. Neither spoke unless spoken to. Her books were taken, her writing desk removed, her mirror cracked and then replaced with nothing. Minimalist, your grace, said a steward. For your peace of mind. She smiled faintly. They feared her mind, they should have feared her memory. Each day followed the next like a punishment. The same tea, the same silent meal, the same damp air. At night she whispered to the walls, not prayers but names. The names from her mother's letters, the ones who signed the erasure. Navis, Mendoza, Torno. Each of you has a brick in this cell. I hope the stone is heavy on your conscience. But of course they had none. Once during a health inspection, a royal physician came to observe her. He tapped her wrists, checked her eyes, asked her if she ever felt the urge to scream. No, she answered. Because what follows screaming is silence, and I've had enough of that. Weeks bled into months. She began to keep time by the length of her candle's burn, not by the bells of the court. She scratched tally marks behind a loose panel in the wardrobe. She took candle wax and molded it into the shape of her mother's brooch again and again. Each time it cooled, she crushed it in her hand. Wax crumbled like memory. One night a storm broke overhead. The wind howled. A shutter flung open. She wrapped herself in the faded shawl of her mother and walked barefoot into the corridor, cold stone beneath her, dripping ceiling above. And in the darkness, a question finally escaped her lips, not to the gods but to the silence itself. Am I still here, or have I become the ghost they wanted me to be? That same night, in a forgotten drawer of her room, she found an old candle with a red seal embedded inside. It was not from the palace. It was from Turin, from the villa where her mother died. She held it close, lit it. And as the wax melted, she saw ink bleeding through the parchment inside. A name, a place, a truth not yet burned. She did not sleep that night. She sat, spine straight, eyes open, watching the wax fall. They buried her history, she whispered. Now it's time I dig up mine. They took away her voice, so she wrote with silence. The day after the storm, Leonor awoke to a stillness so deep it felt staged. Her room was as cold as ever, the tea as tasteless, the corridors just as empty. But something had shifted in her spine, in her breathing, in her gaze. She was no longer simply surviving the winter wing. She was watching. It began with paper, illegally acquired, smuggled by a maid who owed her mother a long-forgotten kindness. It wasn't much, a few crumpled pages, half burnt at the edges, but it was enough. Leonor sat on the floor beneath the shuttered window and began to write, not memoir, not poetry, but a ledger, names, dates, events. Everything she remembered from her mother's letters, everything she had witnessed since arriving, and everything they had tried to erase. If they fear my voice, let them fear my handwriting. Next came the messengers. She began sending letters, disguised in diplomatic phrasing, to sympathetic nobles across Europe, men and women whose lands had once respected Isabella II or feared her. No threats, no demands. Just one sentence repeated in different forms. The silence that buried her will not last. She taught me to listen. Now I write. Some never replied, but a few did. A countess in Naples, a bishop in Lyon, a scholar in Lisbon. Each sent back something: documents, maps, financial ledgers, pieces of a puzzle long forbidden. Leonor laid them all out one by one on the floor of her chamber. By moonlight, she rebuilt the truth they tried to kill. But even as she moved, she stayed quiet. She wore the same dresses, ate the same food. She bowed when required, smiled when expected. Let them believe I've cracked, she whispered once to her reflection. A cracked statue cannot be feared. But statues don't blade, she did. Every time she sharpened the broken brooch to cut into wax seals, every time she copied forged decrees, her fingers blistered and blackened by the ink. The turning point came when she bribed the royal archivist. He was old, tired, greedy. She paid in memories, not gold. She offered him a diary of her mother's early reign, hand-copied by Leonor herself. He wept when he read it. I thought she was mad. No, Leonor said, she was sane. The world simply broke around her. In exchange, he gave her the one document she'd never been allowed to see, the original order of abdication. Signed not in Isabel's handwriting, but forged by 3 men still alive, still in power. Leonor read it slowly, then folded it, not in anger, not in triumph, but in recognition. You didn't just steal her crown, she whispered. You stole her voice. Now I'll use mine to return it with interest. She hid the document beneath a loose tile, not out of fear, out of strategy. A weapon too sharp to unsheath too early. That night she lit every candle in the room. 23 flames, 1 for each year she had lived in silence. Then she whispered their names again, but this time, as a promise. She re-entered the court like smoke, silent, sharp and choking. No one summoned her, but she appeared anyway. It was the feast of Saint Ferdinand. The palace gleamed with candlelight and gold-trimmed velvet. The hall pulsed with music, with flattery, with arrogance that had long forgotten fear. And then she arrived. Leonor di Trastámara, once locked in a forgotten wing, now descended the staircase draped in black silk stitched with red embroidery, a mourning dress disguised as nobility. The room stilled. Fawkes paused Medea. Even Prince Felipe stood startled. She did not bow, she did not smile. She walked straight to the center of the hall where the orchestra had just gone quiet, and dropped a single piece of parchment on the banquet table. The forged abdication order, unfolded, unapologetic, undeniable. 3 of you signed this, she said, voice calm as glass. None of you were my mother. The silence broke like porcelain. A cardinal coughed, a noblewoman gasped. One of the signatures belonged to the host of the evening. Leonor picked up a glass of wine, the same vintage once reserved for Queen Isabel according to royal records. She raised it in mock toast, to correction, and to the memory of a queen the rest of you would rather forget. She drank and walked away. That same night, Cardinal Mendoza received a gift at his chamber. A goblet identical to the one Leonor held. Inside, a folded copy of one of Isabel's last letters, written in a child's handwriting. You prayed for her soul, Your Eminence. Did you ever pray for your own? He was found dead the next morning, slumped beside his bed, the goblet still warm, no marks, no poison discovered, the cause of death, divine judgment, they said. But everyone in court began drinking water the day after. Then came the masquerade, a grand affair in honor of trade alliances, masks of ivory, silk, feathers. Leonor arrived in red velvet and a black lace mask shaped like a hawk's beak. She danced with nobles, ministers, bishops, each one oblivious, until she reached the grandson of General Navis, a young man groomed for war, soaked in pride. They danced, and as the final turn of the waltz echoed, he faltered, collapsed. By the time the music stopped, blood bloomed on his white gloves, trickling from a wound no one had seen inflicted. A cut so clean, so small it could have been love's mistake, but on his chest, tucked beneath his cravat, a note. Your grandfather surrounded her chambers, now I have circled yours. The next morning, the royal court assembled in crisis. Who gave her permission to attend these events? She was never officially banned. She is exposing everything. She, said Felipe quietly, is reminding us who we tried to bury. That evening he summoned Leonor. For the first time they spoke as equals. Why now? He asked. Because history only listens once the blood dries, she replied. And you want what exactly? Nothing that can be given, she said, only what must be remembered. That night the palace didn't sleep. Guards whispered, ministers trembled. And somewhere in the archives, a clerk quietly began restoring the royal file labeled Isabella II, Reign from Ashes, because fear had returned to the court, not in the form of war, but in the form of a woman no one could silence anymore. Justice did not come with a scroll, it came with a blade. The court called it a reconciliation, an act of peace, a royal session of historical rectification. A farce. Leonor stood at the center of the Hall of Mirrors, where monarchs once signed treaties soaked in perfume and politics. But today the air reeked of sweat. She presented her case, document after document, testimony after testimony. Letters, maps, death ledgers, even a copy of her mother's posthumous psychological declaration, forged and stamped by 3 still living councilmen. She ended with one phrase: "You didn't kill her with daggers, you killed her with decrees." And then she opened the casket. Yes, a real one, carried in by 6 men cloaked in black, the same size as a child's. Inside were dolls stuffed with shredded parchment, each one bearing the name of a conspirator. One by one she called them forward: Mendoza, Torno, Zuniga, each one forced to kneel before the mock coffin, each one handed a knife and a single sheet of royal parchment. "Rewrite what you did, then bury it with your hands." Some refused. The ones who did were later found with their tongues cut and nailed to the wooden doors of the council chambers, nailed through parchment. Felipe tried to stop her, but the people had begun to gather outside, candles. Portraits of Isabel II, songs once banned now sung in soft tremble, and then came the first scream. In the square, a noble's body hung from the royal banner, scrawled on his chest in blood. For every lie written, a spine must be broken. The crown had a choice: face the dead or become one of them. A decree was issued the next day, signed, stamped. Leonor's hand trembled when she read it, but not from weakness. "Let it be known that Queen Isabel II of Spain shall be reinstated in full title and honor. Her memory shall be etched in marble, not just in grief." The seal was hot. She pressed it into wax and whispered, "Now she has weight again." But the court wasn't done bleeding. That night, one final tribunal convened in secret. Leonor stood behind a curtain, veiled in black, unseen. A dozen men sat in a circle. At the center, a bowl of ink, mixed not with water but with blood. Each one dipped a quill, wrote their confession. The floor beneath them was stone. When they finished, it was red. They burned the papers in silence, but Leonor already had copies. She stepped forward, no applause. No music, just the sound of her boots on wet stone. "Do you feel cleansed?" she asked. "Good, now kneel for the ghosts." From that day, no one in court dared say her mother's name with anything but reverence. Statues rose. Books were unbanned, but no one celebrated because it wasn't healing. It was atonement bought in blood. She didn't want a throne. She wanted a name no one would dare erase again. Leonor never ruled a kingdom. She never wore a crown. She never sat on the throne of Spain. But Spain stood still when she walked. After the last tribunal, she disappeared from court life. No proclamation, no exile. She simply vanished. Some said she returned to the villa in Turin where her mother died. Others whispered she joined a convent under another name, where ink was her only prayer. There were rumors of a woman with silver hair teaching children in a mountain town how to write letters that couldn't be forged. But no one ever found her grave because she never wanted one. Statues crack, marble fades, but a story told right outlives every tomb. The last letter attributed to her was found decades later, hidden in the binding of a banned history book. It read, "I was not the Queen's daughter, I was her revenge. Let those who write history do so with clean hands, or no hands at all." That page now hangs in a private museum in Seville, under glass. Next to a cracked mirror and a black veil, tourists pass it by. Most don't read it, but those who do never forget the name Leonor di Trastámara. So I ask you, if history had buried your mother alive, would you have done the same? Would you have smiled in the palace that murdered her? Would you have waited in silence? Or would you have carved your story back into the walls that erased her? Let us know what you would have done. Would you forgive? Would you rise? Or would you burn it all down? Backhand index pointing right, drop your thoughts below. Movie camera, and if this story stirred something inside you, subscribe so the ghosts of history can finally speak again.